All right, so it certainly is a pleasure to be here today. And sort of my task that's been given to me is to sort of give you a sense of the state of value-based care here in the United States. As mentioned, our firm does work in a variety of different countries around the world, and I think that for any American to hear some of the statistics that were mentioned during the opening comments about how poorly our health care delivery system compares to other high wealth countries should be sobering and should suggest a need for fundamental change. And I do share the sentiment that value-based care can be a means. It is not in and of itself an end, but a means to trying to get the incentives better aligned within the American healthcare system so that we can ultimately get better models of care. And with better models of care, we're going to get better outcomes and be able to do that for millions and millions of Americans. So in terms of the current state, I'll talk a little bit about HSG, but the focus of my time will really be talking about the current state as well as the potential future state of value-based care in the United States. It's a topic that I get asked about a lot, given my background as a policymaker and then now as a consultant working across a wide array of different organizations, multiple states, different payer types, and such. But then I was also asked to talk to the election implications. So I was asked to prepare this deck in advance of the Tuesday election. So I sent over the four possible scenarios for how the election could play itself out. I also used my own crystal ball for what I thought was going to be the result. If you saw the slides in advance, you know that I'm not a very good predictor of election results. And in fact, sitting here today, we don't yet know fully the control of Congress. And so I'm actually going to speak to what I think is sort of almost a hybrid of two of the options that I presented in terms of what I think the election means for value-based care. So first off, in terms of HSG, as a company founded 6.5 years ago with really a singular focus on value-based care. Started just by me, but now we're a team of 15 individuals. We have team members on 3 continents. We work with a wide array of different organizations. I would say is that our niche has really been working with providers. And when I say the word provider, I define that very broadly. But a lot of providers and in a lot of sectors that haven't got as much attention in terms of value-based care and contracting. We, for instance, do very little and have done very little for hospital systems, but we work a lot with physician groups of varying sizes and organizational structures. We also work with a variety of different specialty providers that really, as I say, haven't had a lot of focus in terms of value-based care and contracting, but our clients are very interested in seeing what they can do to maybe begin to apply value-based contracting principles into their contracts with payers. Just a couple of examples. One of our longstanding clients, the nation's largest provider of OB hospitalist services. Another one of our clients is the nation's largest provider of ABA services, so services for children with autism. But just gives you a flavor, organizations, companies, providers that haven't typically been a focal point for whom there aren't really well-developed models. And in fact, I think if we, as a team, like anything, we always like the idea of having to think out of the box and having to think very differently. We do a little bit of work on the payer side, like very specialized payers. So one of our longstanding clients is one of the nation's very few fully integrated duals plans for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Very unique set of very expensive but exceptionally important Medicaid-funded services on the long-term care side of that benefit. So that's just a little bit about us. All right, so in terms of the current state of value-based care, and if you had told me back when I even left government in 2018 and founded HSG, that we would be sitting here today and I'll show you some statistics in a minute from the Learning Action Network in terms of where we actually sit relative to value-based contracting. I would say at that time that I would have thought we would have made more progress. I guess when I founded the firm 6+ years ago, I was very, very bullish that we were very close to the tipping point. Part of that was because in my job as the Medicaid director in New York, I had a big focus near the end of my 7+ year tenure of driving that very large payer, one of the largest public payers in the world, into value-based care. We moved from basically about 20-25% of our payments to providers being value-based to north of 80% of our payments being value-based. That's tens of billions of dollars moving from a fee-for-service incentive structure to a value-based payment incentive structure, which was quite challenging, but also I think transformational for the New York State healthcare system. But I also, in retrospect, I probably was too optimistic back then and should have been, acknowledged some of the structural challenges that have sort of prevented us from getting to that mythical tipping point, the tipping point at which value-based care contracting, value-based contracting really becomes the default method for contracting. Fee-for-service becomes the exception. And I think one of the big things that we've struggled with, and both on the provider and frankly on the payer side, has been our continued reliance on the fee-for-service chassis. The fact that we are in essence trying to jerry-rig fee-for-service claims processing systems to facilitate value-based contracts has limited us in terms of the types of arrangements we can do, the speed at which we can implement them, the quality of the data that we can get into the hands of providers in a timely fashion. And as a result, I think that has made this transition a longer, more challenging. Now, I am optimistic that while I don't think we will be, say, off the fee-for-service chassis by the end of this decade, I think some of the issues associated with it will be resolved by that time. I do still believe that fee-for-service's days are truly numbered. And I believe that the data I'm going to present to you today reinforces that belief. So the Learning Action Network, which was created back under the Obama administration as part of the Affordable Care Act, it's a bipartisan group. It continues to operate. Sort of look at it as sort of the go-to location for data each year relative to where we are as a nation in terms of value-based contracting. This is directly out of the most recent survey that they have done. This is focused on the payers as who they survey. And basically about a quarter of payments to providers across the payers, payer types, are in two-sided financial risk deals, so there's upside and downside risk. And as you'll see that the leader in this has historically been Medicare, and in particular Medicare Advantage, Medicaid coming behind that, and then commercial one step behind that as well. But I think overall, and if you look at the next slide, you'll see that we are making progress sort of across all payer types, but we still have more work to do. So that's where we are today. Actually, it's probably where we are 2 years ago, or just because of the lag in data. But I think we've made probably, sitting here today in 2014, the tail end of 2014, even more progress than what those graphs have shown. Kind of where are we going, in particular, where are we going by 2030? And I think 2030 is an important date for us to put out there. Why? Because first and foremost, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, the primary driver within the federal government of value-based care and contracting, has set as its goal that for the Medicare fee-for-service program, that 100% of Medicare fee-for-service members will be attributed to an APM, an alternative payment model in Medicare by the end of the decade. Also, we've got commitments from some of the nation's largest insurers. United Healthcare is probably the poster child for this, who itself has also committed to be entirely in value-based contracts for all lines of business, for all provider types, by the end of this decade. What we're seeing, at least from the government policy side, as well as even from the private insurance side, is increasing desire and momentum to get to that mythical tipping point. So in terms of the payers and what the payers think both about today and in the future, and I got this out of a Bain report, just in terms of what do they think about APMs, where we're going and such. And the bottom line from this is that payers remain very bullish. They believe that at the end of the day, we will continue to see more APMs in place. Very few think that activity in value-based contracting will decrease. And in fact, actually relatively few people even see it sort of just holding steady. In terms of top facilitators and top barriers, not shockingly, these are health plan executives, that the top facilitator is health plan interest and readiness. As someone who works with insurance companies literally every single day and negotiating with them, I think we overestimated the degree to which insurers were really ready for value-based contracting. We've had more than a few examples of situations where because of like technological limitations on the side of the plan, that certain types of arrangements, particularly things like bundled payments, literally could not move forward. Now, I think a lot of that is getting resolved, and particularly when you talk about the non-national insurers, the regional insurers, a lot of them limited by their fee-for-service chassis, which is creaky to say the least. And so while the plans may say that that is the number one facilitator, sometimes I think there's, that depending on where you are in the United States, you may perceive the plans as being less of a true facilitator. But I think generally, there remains a lot of plan interest in value-based care. Next is provider interest in readiness. We definitely are seeing this. Increasingly, providers, I say, in areas that have not historically been a major focus for value-based contracting, beginning to think about what this could mean for them. Sometimes that is motivated by margin compression and the fact that fee-for-service rates not keeping up with costs. And certainly during the pandemic and post-pandemic, labor costs in healthcare ever rising, that's squeezing the margins of lots of different provider organizations and organizations looking for contracts that can reward them for the true value that they create. And then also just provider willingness to take on financial risk. I'll show you some slides in terms of what the providers think about financial risk. Top three barriers is first and foremost that not all providers are willing to take downside risk. That finding is actually correlates with what we saw on some of on the provider side surveys that I'll talk about. And then also it was mentioned the third barrier there, which is provider ability to operationalize. And I think this is sort of like the heart of what HSG does. We end up oftentimes getting requested by providers and say, hey, can you get us into a value-based contract? And we say, sure, how are you going to operate differently? And then there's like this blank look on their face, like, operate differently? We're great. Why can't we just keep doing what we're doing and just get a contract that pays us more because we're good? The fact of the matter is many of these providers have no idea whether they're good or not. They've never even seen claims data to validate whether they're effective at, say, managing total cost of care for their patients. And they also, I think, sometimes underappreciate the fact that what the payer wants out of this new contract is incremental improvement. They want you to lower costs off current baseline. They want you to improve HEDIS performance. They want you to do things differently in order to justify the fact that they're going to give you some amount of increased reimbursement, whether that's an upfront uptick in potentially one or more of your fee-for-service rates or shared savings on the back end. It's not just free money. And so I think that sometimes the rude wake-up call for some providers in value-based care is the need to begin to actually change how they provide care, change how they're organized, to change their actual core clinical and business model in order to be effective in these contracts. So just a little bit more in terms of adoption and prediction rates. As I say, our firm's focused on trying to make the world a better place. Do executives at the payers think that this, in fact, will make the world a better place? I think overall, they do believe that it's going to lower costs, it's going to improve outcomes. Not only do they believe this is where we're going, but they also think it is the right direction to go. All right, so in terms of the providers and what providers think is, and this is a lot harder to assess, in the sense that the diversity of provider, and as I say, and for the HSG, we use that word very broadly. I think a lot of times Americans tend to think of healthcare as being like hospitals provide it, and then maybe there's some independent doctors, and that's the end of the healthcare story. Healthcare is a sixth of our economy. It is a very diverse sector. It's obviously a huge sector. And so there are lots and lots of organizations, providers of different types who look at this. So there isn't necessarily a good single source. So I kind of struggled a little bit to find a few different sources to put this together, including a hospital operations outlook survey that found that 29% of hospital leaders report substantial cost savings from their models, while also that survey found that virtually every hospital system in the United States, at least of all the ones that replied to their survey, all had at least one APM in place. But I think that particularly the hospital sector, a lot of these provider surveys are very hospital-centric, definitely feeling as if there is a it really hasn't necessarily benefited them as organizations, but definitely see that that's the future and feeling that the payers are definitely pushing them in that direction. I think part of the problem is, particularly for hospital systems, is that the pivot to value-based care is not an easy one. Hospitals are large organizations, oftentimes very bureaucratic. They have long established sets and ways of operating, and to simply flip a switch with a new contract type is not an easy undertaking. And so I think that helps to explain why the value-based arrangements haven't necessarily been a financial boon for many of them. Also, I think worth noting is that when physicians were surveyed, that there is an interest in value-based contracting, although as you start talking about downside risk with physicians, there's a nervousness there, not surprising. Although our experience in New York was, as we pushed, and value-based care and how we defined it, sort of we called level one, the sort of minimum standard of what is a value-based arrangement, was an upside-only contract. So there was some upside shared savings opportunity, although most of the shared savings was captured by the insurance company. But what we found was that once physicians organized themselves and had a little success in the upside, they didn't like the fact that 80% of the shared savings that they were generating was kept by the insurance company. That once they'd made the investment and they really felt that a lot of what was achieved was the direct result of their actions, they very much wanted to get into higher risk contracts. Now, sometimes I'll have to say, and I always advise this, is that sometimes it's better to walk before you run. And we've had more than a few clients who come to us and said, you know, we signed this risk contract, upside, downside, and then all of a sudden, the insurance company told us that we're gonna owe them $1 million or $2 million at the end of the year. And they didn't know why. And it was ultimately because they signed a contract that was not a good contract for them, given the patients that they serve and the types of services that they provide, or that their organization just wasn't ready. But I do believe that once you get into that and you start seeing the value of what you're creating and you begin to feel success, you want more and more of that shared savings to be captured. So what does HSG think? Are we getting to the tipping point? And I think bottom line for me is, and while 2030 in some ways seems like a long time away, other times doesn't seem so far away, I do think we are going to get to the tipping point. And I define the tipping point as 50% of all payments are in upside and downside arrangements. So as you remember back to the land survey, which was I think 2023 data, showed us that a quarter. So that means we need to double the amount of payments that are flowing through upside and downside arrangements. I believe that is possible. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about the election implication, but there are some scenarios coming out of the election that could actually accelerate that. Now, we have, as I mentioned, there's challenges, impediments that stand in the way of adoption. Some of those we will, I believe, solve. Other ones we will not by 2030. In terms of what we will solve, I think technology is helping us overcome the interoperability issues. Not pure interoperability, but I do think that it's becoming easier to share data amongst organizations. health information exchange is becoming more sophisticated, more robust, easier and cheaper to do. And I think that will all continue. Predictive risk modeling, artificial intelligence, machine learning, I think it's all going to get better. I think that's going to allow healthcare providers to be more proactive and really figuring out which patients are the ones that, not necessarily who cost you a lot last year, but who are the patients that are going to cost you a lot next year unless you're able to actually do targeted interventions. Oftentimes in healthcare, we chase our tail in the sense that we are looking back at historic costs and assuming that's a predictor of the future. That is oftentimes a very wasteful exercise because we know that there is regression to the mean. We know that there are patients who maybe had a bad year last year for a variety of reasons that cost a lot of money, but whatever happened then has been resolved and now they're on a much better trajectory. But then there's also the rising risk populations. The individuals who don't look in any sort of outlier analysis of claims will never show up as a patient of concern, but there's issues brewing, and I think that as we get more sophisticated in our modeling, we do a better job integrating multiple data sources. I think by 2030, we will have really good predictive models, much better than we have today. I think provider readiness, I'm very bullish on this. I think especially if we get some additional policy changes at the national level, which I'll talk about. And then lastly, payer readiness. I definitely think that the payers will have their acts fully together. Many of them already do by the end of the decade. Not all problems will be solved. And sometimes it's like, I've heard this, particularly on the provider side, oh, Jason, we can't possibly do value-based care and contracting because of A, B, C, or D. We don't have a population health management solution, and we can't afford to get the right one, or our EMRs aren't fully integrated, or they're old generation, and a lot of reasons to not basically try to stay in the status quo of fee-for-service. But I think a lot of we're sort of picking away at those issues, and some will be solved. But the things that won't be solved are, I think we're still going to be stuck in a HEDIS outcome measure. I've been I don't know if there's anybody from NCQA here today, but I've been a critic of HEDIS measures because I don't think they really measure what we should care about in healthcare. I think they measure a lot of process. And unfortunately, we use it. Why? Because it's claims-based and it's easy to collect. But we're just continuing our reliance on the fee-for-service chassis. We got to get to a better set of outcome measures. I wish I was more optimistic we're going to get there by 2030. The fee-for-service chassis, I still think we're going to be stuck with it. I think there will begin to see providers really breaking free of it. We do have some examples of some that are out there already, but I still think it's going to be there. SGOH clarity. Which types of SGOH, social determinants of health strategies, work, which ones for which populations. I don't think we will have full clarity. There's still a lot of experimentation going on, but I'm not convinced we will have a lot of clarity in terms of for these populations, for these issues, these are the things you should do. And then lastly, health equity. I do not think we will have solved, unfortunately, health equity. It will still have a lot of inequality in 2030. All right, favorite topic. Got asked this question a lot last night at dinner. What are the implications for BBC as a result of the vote? And as I say, we don't yet know. There's a lot we do not know about the result. In the sense, we don't know the control of the House, although I would say it probably looks like a narrow Republican majority there, which would suggest that the Republicans will have control of both the House, Senate, and obviously President Trump's victory. All suggests that, and these were the four scenarios I laid out, both potential wins. In essence, where I think we come down is somewhere between outcomes 3 and 4, which is, I think where we end up is probably most likely is what I would call a modest red wave, meaning that Republicans control the presidency, both houses of Congress, but their majority we already know the majority in the Senate's 52-48, and the majority in the House of Representatives is going to be quite narrow. To give you a sense of how this outcome compares, so the Affordable Care Act, which was passed in the first term of President Obama. President Obama, when he got elected, he had not just the presidency, He had 60 votes, Democratic votes in the U.S. Senate, and he had a healthy majority and a functional majority in the House of Representatives. That was a real wave, and even with that, if you think back to the Affordable Care Act and how hard it was to get the Affordable Care Act passed, and how for many people who were advocating for national health care reform, how quote-unquote watered down it appeared to be at the end, it took every single one of those votes practically to get it to the finish line, and there were many times when it didn't look like it was going to get there. So that just gives you a little context. While it was a very good election for Republicans, the ultimate where they stand today is, I think, their degree of power and ability to change public policy is not going to be sort of the full red wave. It'll be somewhere between options 3 and 4. I will skip to those options. Okay, so. As I say, it's a little bit of a hybrid. I'll talk to both these two, but there's obviously similarities. First and foremost, since I don't think this is going to be a full red wave, I am not thinking that the Affordable Care Act is going to be repealed. If it were repealed, and if the quote-unquote replacement for it was not as robust from a coverage standpoint, probably we'll see what the Congressional Budget Office would estimate, but somewhere probably in the range of 25 to 30 million Americans would lose health insurance. Politics around the ACA have changed radically. It is not an unpopular thing. It's well established. 42 of the states in the country have done the Medicaid expansion. So I personally think that it hasn't really been a major campaign issue this time around. But I would say that there is probably some chance that at least somebody in Congress in particular could decide they want to push for it. I also don't think necessarily, if it was a really big red wave, could we see some what is called entitlement reform, major structural changes to Medicare. I really also don't think this is that likely. I think that President Trump was very politically shrewd and sort of staying away from those issues and try to avoid giving his opponent, the opportunity to paint him as somebody who was going to really sort of, quote unquote, trash Medicare. There's out there, if you probably heard of the 2025 project, which is out of the Heritage Foundation and DC think tank. That has proposed MA, Medicare Advantage for all. So basically making Medicare Advantage the default. Right now, 50% of all Americans on Medicare are enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan, so we're already 50% of the way there. But it would be a very steep hill to climb to force the remaining 50% of Medicare beneficiaries into some kind of Medicare Advantage. Could you create some additional incentives, including within that? I think that one of the outcomes of this is that I do think that the war on Medicare Advantage, and when I say a war, I mean that there's been much increased scrutiny of Medicare Advantage under the Biden administration, and programmatic changes that have been adverse to the interests of the insurers in that market. It has had a direct impact on plan bottom lines. You've seen, and after the election, many of the insurers' stock prices went through the roof. So I do think that MA, which has been a robust place for value-based contracting, and I think it was mentioned, it has more value-based contracting in MA than any of the other sectors. I think that will rev itself back up as the pressure on those insurers is lessened. I think one of the consequences of the election is the health equity, which is a major focus of the Biden administration. I think that you will cease to hear any real discussion on health equity. Not that I think people are opposed to health equity. I just don't think it's going to be a focal point. We saw this when Obama transitioned to Trump. If you remember, under the Affordable Care Act, the triple aim, which was created, and everybody was triple aim, triple aim, triple aim. And then in came the Trump administration, and the words triple aim were removed from all of the HHS and CMS websites. Now, they were challenged because they did not have a replacement sort of nomenclature to sort of come up with. However, because it was so closely associated with the Affordable Care Act, I think they felt politically they had to not use it, particularly as they were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. But I do think that we'll see something similar with health equity, that will not be the focus. Medicaid block grants, this is another structural change Republicans have advocated for. The idea is to try to slow the rate of growth in Medicaid spending. Medicaid spending is now as large as Medicare practically. These two programs I mentioned, $4-point-something trillion. Medicaid and Medicare are both closing in on $1 trillion programs. I think Medicaid is about $900 billion a year national enterprise. Medicaid block grants, the versions we've seen, at least in the short term, aren't too onerous on states. However, the concern is long-term, what that would mean. I think it's going to be, one of the biggest negative effects, or in terms of subsets of the healthcare industry that could be negatively affected, is our hospitals. And I think hospitals already are in very difficult financial circumstance in many parts of this country, maybe not right here in South Florida, but in many other parts of the country. And so as a result, anything that would begin to siphon off or slow Medicare or Medicaid spending into those facilities would be, potentially could be the sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. PE involvement in healthcare, I think, will grow. I think you'll see more deal making. I think you'll see less scrutiny. Under the option that I could also, if we do have Democratic control of the House of Representatives, I think we could still see some, the Democrats particularly in the House, raising some concerns about private equity involvement in healthcare. They could have hearings. They could, they're not likely to pass any legislation. But I do think it's going to be an area to watch. But if it's Republicans, I think a lot of that scrutiny will go. And I think with that, you'll begin to see more of it, maybe even more acceleration in deal making. The key thing about the Trump administration, if we learned anything about the Trump 1.0 that I think will apply in Trump 2.0, is that President Trump has a set of issues that he cares very much about, and he focuses his energy on those issues. There's a whole lot of other things that the federal government does that he doesn't necessarily care about, and his and his White House's view on those is that we're going to hire people to run their agencies and deal with those things, and unless those issues somehow bubble up in some significant political blowback for the president, he and his administration are going to stay out of it. They are not sensitive to classic sort of interest group politics, which is what you have historically seen. They don't care at all about the American Hospital Association. They don't care about the American Medical Society. Those are traditionally interest groups that both Democrats and Republicans in the White House have been concerned about. But the way he has built his coalition and his support and who his voters are, those types of groups, those kinds of interest groups are just not a priority for him. And so what we saw with the Affordable Care, obviously there was a big fight around whether to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That effort ultimately failed. But in the meantime, the president appointed a Secretary Azar to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he appointed Seema Verma to be the CMS director, and appointed Adam Boehler to be the head of CMMI. And I've been observing the CMMI and known all of the directors, and Liz Fowler, the current director of CMI, is a friend of mine. But what I would say is, while I love Liz and a lot of the things that the Biden administration did, I think Adam Boehler was by far the most prolific CMMI director we had. And part of the reason, and in fact, it seemed like if the number of models coming out of the Trump administration in those early couple of years was just sort of like breathtaking. And I think and part of the reason for that is because the White House didn't necessarily care about value-based care and contracting, and they kind of hired Adam Boehler, and even within HHS, CMS kind of deferred to him on what was within the scope of responsibility of CMMI. Adam was free as a decision maker to just go. And anytime he put out a model that somebody objected to, and there were a few examples of this, that people did the typical way. They would go to the White House and try to talk to the president's daughter and son-in-law and others, and try to get somebody to stop Adam Bowler, but the White House and others literally ignored it and said, that's not our job, that's not what we do. And a lot of these complaints by these interests fell on deaf ears. And so ultimately, what I think about when I think about like what does the Trump administration ultimately mean for value-based care, it comes down to who they hire for these key spots. Azar was a very seasoned hand, former Bush administration official, very experienced in managing and running federal agencies, and was not particularly ideological. Adam Bowler was ambitious, smart, experienced, and 100% committed to value-based care, and was given free rein to run his agency. If similar individuals are appointed in this next term, you could see the Trump administration actually accelerating the move to value-based care, getting us to that tipping point even faster. And I think the most powerful thing they could do, and we actually saw this at the end of the first Trump term, and we heard this from Seema Verma as the CMS director, was basically rattling the saber relative to mandatory models, the words that always make everyone nervous. Mandatory, Medicare mandatory models. Medicare is the #1 payer in the United States when it comes to innovation and value-based care. They are the ones who set, and this is a Medicaid director, it drives me crazy to say it, but it's true, is that when they decide to take a major policy move, everyone else follows suit. I mean, we pay hospitals today on a DRG basis in fee-for-service. It was CMS had said, we're moving away from per diem, we're gonna go to DRG. The minute Medicare did, all the other national payers in the United States followed suit, and that became the default. If Medicare begins to implement full mandatory models in a variety of different areas, doesn't even have to do it in all areas, but just in a few areas, I think that's gonna get payer and provider attention like nothing else could. And I think that could really, really accelerate the move. So really, that's what it's. I'm a Democrat. I voted for Harris, but I am also somebody who believes at the end of the day, and this is probably me more with my heart than my brain voting this thing. But I actually sit here today. As I say, I'm hopeful that we'll have a repeat in terms of who the president will appoint to these key jobs. I'm a little nervous about a former presidential candidate who I will not name, who has a lot of interest in vaccinations and other public health related issues that are as potentially someone getting the HHS job, and I'm not sure what that would mean. But I think particularly the jobs to look to, if you're looking for reading tea leaves, look to see who the names that are begin to get floated for CMS director. What are the names that get floated for CMMI director? I don't necessarily agree with Seema Verma on everything. However, I know she's adamant about value-based care, and she's the one who's probably was most likely to sort of be aggressive on mandatory models. Could she come back as an HHS secretary? I could certainly see that. I also definitely could see, when Adam Bowler left, I think he wants a job somewhere in Secretary of State's office. Now he's interested in foreign affairs, but so I don't think Adam Bowler's coming back. But Brad Smith, who took over for him, recently had a very successful exit when his company CareBridge was purchased recently by Carelon. So in theory, he's a free agent. He was, I think, about a little less than 2 years the head. Someone like him would be a logical appointment there. And if you sort of got that sort of pairing, I think we could actually see the acceleration that a lot of us in the value-based care world have been looking for. And frankly, more so than we would see under a Harris administration, because the Harris administration, one, would be thinking about a second term. Two, would be structured in the very traditional way with very interest group sensitive and very sensitive probably on the issues such as mandatory models. And we also learned with the Biden administration was part of the reason it took so long for models to come out of the Biden administration was because there were so many decision makers. Every idea had to be vetted, like 10, 15 people had to sign off on it. And it meant it took over a year for the first model ACO REACH to come to the fore. So I sit here today hopeful that that we will see that repeat of Trump 1.0, and we'll get to that tipping point in value-based care even maybe quicker than 2030. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions from the audience. Yes, Ed?
What y'all do is a strategy to help people start that negotiation process.
Yeah, so I don't know if everyone heard it or online heard it in terms of the question, but is a lot of providers feeling like, particularly in certain parts of the country, feeling like payers aren't all that responsive, aren't sure how to approach a payer, unsure that payers are wanting to go into value-based arrangements. And that is oftentimes a lot of our clients that we work for have had sort of, I'll call it maybe not a bad experience, but certainly not a rewarding experience with payer discussions. And there's, why that happens it depends. There's a lot of factors that can contribute to a conversation not going very far. Sometimes it's how the provider goes about entering into the discussion. Sometimes, and I'll give you an example of that. Sometimes it's that who they're talking to at the plan, and a lot of these plans are large, also bureaucratic organizations, and sometimes who you're talking to, sometimes, always it matters who you're talking to. If you're going to the wrong person at the plan, you're wasting your breath talking about value-based care, because that's not what that person does. That's not what they're held accountable for, and so you can waste a lot of time talking to the wrong people. But I would say is that one of the things that we talk about is the need to present plans with a value proposition that is going to be compelling because it addresses specific pain points and is consistent with what their priorities are. And priorities differ, pain points differ based on the health plan type that you're talking to. If you're talking to a Medicare Advantage plan, they care a lot about star ratings. They care a lot about growth. And so if you are approaching them, you need to make sure that your strategy is going to address those key issues. And if you do that in a compelling way, that's going to make it easier to get into a contractual arrangement. The second thing I would say is that another example is on the Medicaid side. Medicaid plans care a lot about top-line growth, but they also care a lot about what the state officials who hold them accountable for think of them. And are they seen as innovative? Are they seen as doing things consistent with the goals of the state Medicaid agency? And state Medicaid agencies across the country have different sets of priorities, different issues that they're working on. But the one thing any state plan or a state Medicaid plan decision maker is always worried about is falling afoul of what his regulators and payers think of them. So understanding the local context is also really crucial. But I do think at the end of the day, it also requires developing a pitch that's highly targeted to the needs and interests of that payer, and frankly, I'm going to say aggressive, but a steady follow-up with that payer in order to really get to what I would call true contract negotiations. But the key is find the right person in the plan, understand what the pain points are, what the issues are, develop a value proposition that addresses it, go in with a deck that isn't just about who you are and why you're great. A lot of our clients have gone in, met with payers, and they have a deck of 25 slides, talks about who they are and what they do, and isn't great. There's no definitive next step. There's no, here's our proposal, you want to react to it. Here's our proposed next step. Can we send you a draft term sheet for your consideration? At least to spur action. Many times the plan will say, sure, send it to us. You eventually probably end up negotiating off their developed term sheet. But those sort of tricks of sort of trying to keep the discussion going is really important. Yes?
Yeah. That is, a lot of times, the reason why I think you have the 80% of physicians would like this is because they all think they provide the best care in the world in their specialty. So they've got big egos. And when I look at this, this is really an outcomes approach. And in education, there was an outcomes approach that was tried. And I'm looking at this from the economically challenged hospitals. And is there a downward spiral for them? If you're a great producer and have the ability to change, obviously value-based care is in your sweet spot. But if I'm in a rural area or a very small community and don't have the resources in order to improve, is this going to hurt us?
If the hospitals that are in the situation that you're described are hurting now and the future is not bright, whether you stay in fee-for-service or do value, there's more challenges ahead than behind. So what I would say is that value-based care and contracting is not a panacea for the hospital systems that you mentioned. It can be a better path for those kinds of facilities, particularly, and we see a lot of the hospitals that we see do value-based care, sometimes they're doing it as a defensive maneuver because there's a certain amount of revenue that's inside of their four walls and they want to protect that revenue. And so what they want to do is they want to get into a contract that allows them to basically wall it off and prevent leakage to the maximum degree possible. In theory, while they're doing that, that should give them the ability to then restructure, to sort of think about how do we get out of certain lines of business or become more efficient or different things that if we did it in a pure fee-for-service environment, we get penalized. I tend to see less of that restructuring really happening in the sense that I think you see them doing it to wall off that revenue to the best degree they can, particularly in an environment where they're not the sole actor. I mean, maybe in the communities that you're mentioning, but in a lot of communities, hospitals that are financially challenged are bumping into physician IPAs or other organizations that are doing risk contracting who, based on methods of attribution, are pushing the hospital downstream. I mean, we have a client in New York City that's got roughly 175,000 patients in full risk Medicaid, Medicare contracts with a TPA paying claims downstream to hospitals. And that scares the heck out of those hospitals because they're like, now it's not just the insurance companies we're having to pay attention to, it's these large physician groups who are fiercely independent, empowered by value-based contracting. And so, if the providers in your community beat you to the punch and do their contracting and say, for instance, because of primary care attribution is the primary means of attribution for value-based arrangements, a hospital could be in a situation where the cheese is moved. Like you're now second, you're stuck in fee-for-service potentially forever, or scraps off the table of the physician group. Maybe they give you a handful of shared savings, and in that environment, most of the shared savings that's generated is coming out of your revenue as a hospital, because most of what we're trying to do here is keep people out of the hospital who don't need to be there as a way of generating shared savings. Yes, Mike? Oh, done. All right. I got the off. All right, so thank you very much.